Thank you. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with a question for Paul. I think you were sort of starting to describe the film in your introduction, and I think you used the word fable.
Well, I've been thinking more and more along those terms. It wasn't really how I conceived it, but after I finished it, I realized that, could such a thing like this happen? Probably not.
Which part exactly?
A proud boy, being rehabilitated in this way, finding love this way. I don't know how realistic it is, but it certainly has value as a story. And stories are what we tell ourselves, And so I began to think of this not so much as something ripped from reality, but as a kind of valuable story, allegory, like a Flannery O'Connor kind of story. And so that's why I've been using that word, because I'm trying to fend off these comments that people say, well, I don't believe that. Well, you don't have to believe it, you just have to imagine it.
What do you think then is the value of telling or imagining this story?
Well, I've always been interested in this particular type of character.
Yeah.
He's been, to date, a man, although I'm going to try to venture into the distaff territory. But there's someone who has a sense of guilt, a sense of self-punishment, a sense that he's done wrong, and he could make some kind of amends through his own self-sacrifice. This goes all the way back to Travis Bickle. And so this is an iteration of that, which has a much more life-enhancing conclusion, whereas the others tend to end in death or imprisonment. This doesn't, and so that's the distinction, I guess.
I'd love to bring Sigourney and Joel into it. I think it's your first time working with Paul in both cases, right? I would love to hear, maybe your reaction to the script when you read it, and also how that aligned or did not with your sense of Paul. Obviously, somebody who's such a touchstone figure, and somebody I'm sure you knew his work well before he came to you with the script.
Do you want me to start? I got sent the script by Paul, and as I was reading it and really enjoying it, I was asking myself, when's the violence coming? And I was sort of happy to know that it was coming, but it was coming in a different kind of way than other films. In fact, I was living in New York at the time that First Reformed came out, and I was so I could use a lot of words to describe it. I was so impressed by that film, and impressed covers a whole lot of reasons. And I thought there was a lot of softness and sensitivity in that film with violence sort of in the air, and I felt that about this. But it seemed like this and First Reformed in some ways, even though they're quite linked, are also aren't as rich with violence, that the violence is there in the past, and I was very taken with this particular version of what I thought was a character I was familiar with.
Well, I was immediately intrigued. Paul is a titan, and even though he's written wonderful parts for women, I thought, well, he's written some sort of part for me. Or he wrote it anyway. He's thinking of me. But so I think that I was so astonished by the script it's so dense, and it has no transitions. It has no explanations. It's so spare. It's so mysterious, and I was really blown away by it. And the character of Norma, I sort of took my breath away. I hadn't ever come across a character quite like Norma, certainly not in a contemporary movie. And so I thought, wow, this is fabulous.
Paul, just where did these characters come from for you? Did you start with the characters, or did you start with the idea of the garden, I guess?
I start with the occupational metaphor.
Yeah.
Some kind of, because I've described in the past that these are stories of a man in a room, alone, wearing a mask. The mask is his occupation, and he's waiting for something to happen. And so you're always looking for that occupation that has a resonance that people don't associate with it. People used to think taxi drivers were sort of garrulous and everybody's brother's best friend. But I looked at a taxi driver and I said, this is the heart and soul. This is the black heart of Dostoevsky. That's what it is, riding in this this yellow metal coffin through the sewers of the city. This is Dostoevsky. This is not, your pal. And similarly, approaching other occupations, whether it be a gigolo or a drug dealer or a reverend poker player, you're trying to find a metaphor that has a kind of resonance. What do you think of when you think of a poker player? What do you think of a big game? No. He's in fact a torturer who's hiding out playing cards. So that's what you're looking for. So I'm looking at, I think, a gardener. That's an interesting metaphor. What is he really hiding from? Why is he a gardener? How? And so that's where it starts. And then you have the metaphor, and then you start to branch out. And then you have the larger social stew that he is involved in, whether that be climate change, urban violence, torture, or in this case, race. But it doesn't begin with race. It doesn't begin. It begins with the metaphor, the occupational metaphor.
You've described, or I don't know if you've described, or people have described this as a trilogy, starting with First Reformed, Card Counter, and this one. I don't know if you think that's accurate. I think there's certainly something that connects the films, thematically, but also what Sigourney was saying about the spareness and the density of.
Yeah, well, friends of mine were describing it as a trilogy, and I was objecting, and then I finally realized that, yeah, I think they're right. It probably is. And those three films have similar things, including each one has a phantasmagorical sequence, whether it's levitation or a Christmas event. But here it's driving through nature, and all of nature comes to bloom. And so it felt like, and I know that, our critics love trilogies, they hate tetralogies. And so I thought, well, I better call it a trilogy, because then, if I call it a tetralogy, they'll get angry at me. So now I'm trying to write about this character again, but I have to step aside, and so it's time to make him a her.
Can you elaborate on that?
He's now a nurse, a trauma nurse in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
That's the occupation.
I would go back to the actress and Joel Sigourney. If you want to talk a little bit about the experience of actually working with Paul and being on set and what that was like.
Well, 20 days, that is not very long. And this man was editing as we shot. Sometimes I've never done this before, but we'd shoot a master of the first part of the scene that he needed. Then we'd come in for a two-shot or whatever for the next section of the scene. this is how we shot the scene in the potting shed. And then we'd come in for close-ups. So we didn't waste 1 second of the day. And he never stopped. And he also kept rewriting every single day. The line at the end where I say, "This is obscene," there was another line there that was the one line in the script that I had dared to take issue with from the master. And Paul immediately said, "Yeah, I know what you mean." Anyway, that was in rehearsal, so it was really on that very day that we shot it that you had the line. I don't know when you came up with it.
It was the day before. It sort of, I said, "Oh, that's the word," and luckily, I came up with it the day before, because sometimes you come up with it the day afterward.
Joel, I don't know if you want to talk about it, and also I'm curious just about the physicality of just this character and the role, and so much of it is about just the body language and the actual body of this man.
I can answer sort of both of those questions. They sort of relate to each other. I mean, everything that Sigourney said about working with Paul, I think it was actually 18 days, wasn't it? 18.
Oh, it was 19.
Oh.
And then we went back and we added a day. Yeah.
But to make a movie at that schedule I always feel like you're being chased down the street by a bear. And it wasn't the case here because of how well planned Paul is, how I assume also the history of making cinema when there wasn't a world of digital cameras to just shoot for as long as you wanted and work it out in the edit room. It felt like a very precise filmmaking experience, and not only in the filmmaking but in the writing, and I really appreciated that. But I was also curious as an actor going to work for Paul because, and I've said this before, that part of the things that I identified with as an actor when I was deciding to make or try and make life as an actor was the kinds of characters that Paul was writing back in the day were the things that made me. I wanted to play those kinds of characters, and there I was years later sort of pinching myself that he wanted me to be one of those people. And we had conversations about what Paul expects or requires or would like of a central character in a film, that they occupy a place kind of not introspection, but that they are still a component to a much kind of crazier ensemble, I guess, that he was basically asking me not to act, I think, which I found a bit terrifying because actors like to bring a bag of tricks, and so there was an interesting process where I felt like a good challenge to the physicality that you're talking of. There's not a lot of violence in this film.
Yeah, well, actually, how Joel ended up in the film is, at one point we were going to shoot this in Australia because I wanted to shoot. It's a great garden town, shoot in their summer, our winter. And then COVID came along and we got knocked out of that. But while we were casting, both Ethan Hawke and Oscar Isaac had talked to about just to get their opinions. And I knew that either one would have liked to play it, but I said to them, no, I think this is more of a kind of a 50s kind of lug. This is kind of a kind of a Bob Mitchum kind of guy. And then we started thinking about actors, and because we're going to shoot in Australia, I think, Joel's name comes up, and I said, wow, that's great. He lives here. We can save some money. And then, of course, COVID came along, and everything changed. But fortunately, I already had Joel, and we came and shot it in Louisiana.
And I cost you money. Then I cost you money.
Something Joel mentioned when he was talking about shooting with digital, and I wonder if, Paul, if you can talk a little bit about just. It seems you've been actually quite very prolific, I think, in recent years, and there seems to be, in addition to the restraint of these films, I think there's also seems to me like a sense of freedom, and I'm wondering if that has to do with just, you know.
It has to do with the economics.
Yeah.
Two things: the technology and the Final Cut. Now, the technology gave me Final Cut, which is when I started making films. This film would have been 44 days. Now it's 19, 20 days. That's literally half the amount of time, which means, for practical purposes, half the amount of money. Everything goes faster, the lighting, everything. And so you're not losing footage. You're in fact shooting more film than you shot in twice that time. But you're just losing dead time. You don't leave the floor anymore. You know, I remember when directors used to have trailers. Now, a movie like this, but you head for your trailer. By the time you get there, someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "Mr. Schrader, they're ready." So you never leave the set, and therefore you just work at a much faster pace. And this then gives you artistic freedom because you're working at a lower budget level. You are able to say to your investors with some sincerity and perhaps even some accuracy, "I'll get you your money back." And because you're now working at a price point that starts to make sense. You know, at twice the budget, this film doesn't make sense economically, but it makes sense at this budget. So those are the things that have freed me, because now I know I can make these things. I remember being much younger and in the studio system and wanting to do something Bressonian, but just refusing to do it because I knew it would kill my career. That if I did something like that, everybody would point the finger at me and I would be dead. And so, you know, all right, let's just shoot some more people then. And so now I can finally sort of do that kind of thing and still be financially responsible. I mean, I was, you know, a good Calvinist boy. I do believe it's, and stewardship, I think, is the Christian word for being financially responsible.
I think. Sorry, were you gonna?
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I actually think it frees actors too.
Yeah.
Because everything has to tumble right out of you. There's no weighing of choices. It just erupts.
Yeah, and I also believe, I mean, trailer time was not good for anybody. And it wasn't good for actors either. You know, you would visit them, they would be sitting there, calling their girlfriend, smoking a joint, reading this. And then 2 hours later, you're going to get a knock on your door and come out. And actors, like all farm animals, love to be under the harness. They love to work. And the more they can work, the happier they are. And so, you know, it's good for everyone.
Do you want to quickly respond, the actors? All right, I do think we actually had to wrap it up because Joel has to get on a plane back to Chicago. But Paul will be back tomorrow. He's doing a talk at 2 o'clock in the amphitheater. Come for that. Thank you, Paul, Sigourney, and Joel. Thanks very much.